Good afternoon and welcome. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm joining you from today, the Ngunnawal people. The Academy acknowledges and pays respects to the traditional owners and the elders past and present of all the lands on which we operate, live and work. They hold the memories, traditions, cultures and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. My name is Paul Richards from the Australian Academy of Science, and I'm thrilled to be here today for a special event as part of Science at the Shine Dome 2021. Traditionally, Science at the Shine Dome is a 3-day event in May, where Australia's most influential scientists gather here at the Shine Dome in Canberra. This year, however, things look a little bit different, but in some ways even better, because we're enabling participation across Australia and around the world. So if you're joining us from near or afar, welcome. Throughout 2021, we're bringing you events online to celebrate excellence in Australian science, to recognise outstanding achievements and to cover important science topics. We launched Science at the Shine Dome back in May with the inaugural Ruby Payne-Scott Lecture, and in July we brought you the 2021 Matthew Flinders Lecture. If you missed these lectures by Professor Cheryl Prager and Professor Andrew Holmes, you can find them on our website a month after they were held. This afternoon, we're here for the Academy's annual symposium titled Science and the Public Good. And what better topic to consider as we head into National Science Week? We'll soon hear from some of Australia's most distinguished scientists about how important science is to society. Throughout the event, if you have a question for any of our speakers, please use the Q&A panel on your screen. All the events in the Science at the Shine Dome series are made possible by our event partners. Today I'd like to particularly acknowledge our symposium partner, the University of Queensland. We appreciate their support to be able to bring this important topic to an audience around Australia and the world. Before we hear from our speakers, please welcome the Academy's President, Professor John Shine.
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon all. I too am delighted to be here at this year's annual symposium. The importance of science to society has never been so relevant as it is today. This has been brought into sharp relief by the immediate response to the pandemic, but also by the very topical longer-term challenges of climate change, global pollution and population expansion. Science is at the very centre of our ability to meet these challenges and to improve the social and economic health of our communities. So I very much look forward to hearing from our speakers. I'm sure we will all hear much about taking basic research and driving it through to outcomes for the public good. I'm sure that we all agree on how important it is to remember that again and again it's been basic research, primarily undertaken for new knowledge and understanding, not for a clear applied outcome. That has been the critical seed for significant, usually unexpected breakthroughs that have led to major improvements in humanity's well-being. I have been very fortunate in my own career, in a small way, to have witnessed this so clearly. My postgraduate supervisor worked on Ross River virus and noticed that when you extracted RNA from insect cells using hot phenol, the small ribosomal RNA broke into 2 halves. This did not happen with mammalian cells, or if you use cold phenol. Was this apparent break in the RNA molecule at a specific sequence, or just a general area in the middle of the molecule? An appropriately important study for a student. As a control for the study, though, I sequenced the ends of both insect and mammalian small ribosomal RNA. They were identical. And as it took months back then to do this limited sequencing, we had lots of time to think about what the sequence meant, and also to look at other organisms like mice, flies, and bacteria. To cut a very long story short, it led us to identifying that this sequence was responsible for the binding of the ribosome to messenger RNA at the right place to signal initiation and termination of protein synthesis. This was an exciting story for us, and of course recognition in this very narrow area of biology of the Shine-Dalgarno sequence. Very basic research though, without any suggestion of any practical outcome, except a year later, recombinant DNA, itself arising from esoteric research on bacterial enzymes, hit the scientific stage, leading to gene cloning and creation of the biotechnology industry. Human genes could be put into bacteria and faithfully replicated. But could these bacteria be programmed to express these genes and make lots of gene product, such as insulin for the treatment of diabetes? Of course, as the genetic code is universal, the human insulin gene in bacteria still codes for human insulin, but the regulatory sequence telling the bacterial machinery where to start synthesis is different. You need to put a Shine-Dalgarno sequence in front of the gene. Only then did the bacterial factories produce large amounts of insulin. So that very basic research on the effect of hot phenol on insect RNA contributed in some way to the development of the biotech industry and the ability to synthesize new therapeutic products that save lives. We will undoubtedly hear today of many examples of where basic research has underpinned transformative developments for public good. The success of our response to the current pandemic is clearly a great example. Basic research in molecular biology and virology over decades positioned us well to quickly rise to the challenge to sequence the new viral genome, make accurate diagnostics and then vaccines. But science also enabled us to enact very effective evidence-based public health measures. So history teaches us that we will never completely win the war against new infectious agents. But as they arise and evolve, science gives us the tools, the armaments to win each battle far more quickly and decisively. The current pandemic, of course, has generated much human suffering. But hopefully the silver lining of this pandemic cloud may be a strong reminder of the importance of long-term, sustained commitment and funding of basic research in all areas of science. One of my favourite phrases in science is, imagination based on knowledge is the key to discovery. Imagination based on knowledge is the key to discovery. Humanity has always been rich in imagination, but we need to constantly grow our fundamental knowledge base to deliver real, sustainable advances in public good. I would like to especially acknowledge our convener for this event, Academy Fellow Professor Ian Chubb. Ian is particularly experienced in science for the public good. His vision, insight and passion has really made this event come to life. So thank you, Ian, for all the time and energy you have contributed. I would also, of course, like to acknowledge and thank our event partners, in particular our Symposium partner, the University of Queensland. With your support of Science at the Shine Dome 2021, we are able to bring this very important topic to a wide audience, both here in Australia and around the world. So now, to say a few words, I'd like to pass over to the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Queensland, Professor Deborah Terry. Over to you, Debbie.
Thank you, Professor Shine. Hello, everyone, and greetings from the University of Queensland. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands on which we are meeting, and by paying my respects to their ancestors and descendants as we walk together on the path to reconciliation. Here at the University of Queensland, delivering for the public good is part of our mission, so we're genuinely delighted to be sponsoring this symposium on science and the public good. It's a brilliant topic because scientific knowledge, discovery and translation are critical to unlocking vast opportunities, as well as solving the most bewildering challenges that we face, both here in Australia and across the globe. It's a theme that's also particularly apt, given the decisive role that science has played in our response to the pandemic over the past 18 months. As we all know, our medical scientists and scientific researchers have really been on the front line of our fight against this virus. Time and again, they have fronted up to serve the public good. They've provided timely evidence and guidance to anticipate the likely course of the virus, map its path, and understand more about how it operates. And they've contributed to global work on novel diagnostics, new therapeutics, and vaccine development. Indeed, I'd say that Australia's success in slowing and then stopping the spread of the virus for lengthy periods of the pandemic is largely because our scientists have been front and centre in our response. Thankfully, our governments have been willing to listen to the expert scientific advice and then formulate policy responses based on that advice. But perhaps more importantly, our scientific experts have been visible in the media on a daily basis, offering accurate advice to the community. Their expertise has seeped into our public discourse, and it's influenced the community's very positive response to the COVID restrictions and the public health measures. The media monitoring group, Isentia, found that university experts, scientists and researchers were interviewed or quoted some 67,000 times in news stories about COVID-19 through the course of last year. And by sharing their expertise, those epidemiologists, virologists, immunologists, and public health experts performed a vital community service. They've helped us navigate the uncertainty of this difficult period. They've helped to keep us safe, and they've prepared us for recovery. As we look ahead, the process of scientific discovery and translation will also be crucial to creating a more sustainable future. Science will be at the heart of creating solutions to many of the wicked problems we face as a globe, from climate change and biodiversity protection to food and water security and the prevention of disease. For Australia to play its part in solving these challenges, we need to keep stimulating community interest in science, and we need to encourage and celebrate scientific discovery. Perhaps even more importantly, we need to invest in the translation of our discovery science into new products and services that will deliver benefits, commercial, social and environmental benefits, for the good of Australia, for the good of the world, and for the public good. Finally, I want to thank the Australian Academy of Science for hosting this important symposium and for offering me this opportunity to contribute. I'm looking forward to what I'm sure will be some fascinating discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shine and Professor Terry. As you both illustrated, scientific knowledge, discovery and translation is critical to society. So let's now delve into this further. Today we'll look at the fundamental principles of biology, chemistry, mathematics and physics, and how each are critically important to our lives. First up, we have biology with Professor Laura McKay and Professor John Rasko.
I'm an immunologist and I study a type of white blood cell called a T lymphocyte. And I'm particularly interested in how these T cells can protect the body against disease. And we're interested in learning the mechanisms behind generating good T cell memory. That is the capacity of one of these immune cells to remember infections they've seen before, with the view that we would utilize this information to develop new T cell based vaccines.
Over the last few decades, I've had the privilege of helping use genes and cells as a means to treat serious human diseases like thalassemia, haemophilia, the bleeding disorder, and other cancers. That has involved me studying mechanisms of gene expression, the means by which our DNA expresses the information that it contains, and also improving the efficiency by which we can get genes into cells. Well, that's a difficult question for me to answer, because when I was a young teenager, I lost my dad to a heart attack. And he had come from Hungary as an immigrant after the World War had finished, and lost both of his parents, my grandparents, during the Holocaust. So I was searching for answers as a teenager, and I was looking for answers in all the different corners of human thought. And in the end, I realized that the natural world, biology, and all of the complexity that it offers was something that I could really sink my teeth into. I fell in love with biology, and then it emerged that I fell in love with a subset of biology, not zoology or the study of fungi or infectious diseases, but in fact, human biology and all of the abnormalities that human biology can present.
My love for biology definitely wasn't instantaneous, and it didn't develop in school, but I did a degree in biology, not necessarily because it was a passion, but because I thought it was a sensible thing to do. But during that time at university, I got glandular fever, which is caused by a virus called Epstein-Barr virus. And it was during this time and starting to learn about virology and immunology, that's when I first started to become interested in the immune system. And I actually ended up doing my PhD on that virus, Epstein-Barr virus. But really my passion for science developed once I got in the laboratory and I understood what the discovery process was all about. And that was really very motivating to find out new things that no one had ever found before. Well, biology impacts us in so many ways. I mean, obviously at the individual level with medicine and the treatment of disease and the development of new therapeutics, from treating neurological disorders to cardiovascular treatments to treatments against cancer or new vaccines, that's critically important. But also biology is important at the population level. For example, genomics informs new policies. It's important for economic growth or development of new agricultural strategies or biosecurity. And also biology is important for our future. For example, all the development of new technologies and new discoveries, blue sky research, for example, that's also critically important.
If you study biology and pathology, you can come to make inventions or seek new ideas that may be able to help people here and now. And in doing so, you not only change their lives, but you change the lives of the future forever. Studying biology offers us the opportunity to be able to stand on the shoulders of great thinkers over not just decades, but hundreds and even thousands of years. Understanding medicine, pathology, and biology gives us the privilege to add maybe even just a small little bit of information that contributes to the future of human well-being. So my advice to my younger self would be brave and courageous, and don't be distracted by things that take you off the path. The idea that inspired me when I was 14 years old was that genetics was really cool and really, really interesting to study. But that then transcended its path into a way of treating diseases. And that's where real courage was required.
I would tell myself to understand the value of failure. I tell that to my younger self, and I literally just told that to a PhD student this morning where an experiment had failed. And I told her to really think about what we could learn from that. And failure is absolutely part of the discovery process of science. We always learn something new with every failure that we make. And it's definitely not final. We can always keep moving forward and growing from that experience.
Thanks for being with us, Laura and John. So you both touched on a number of ways that biology can fundamentally be in the public good. I want to talk about what's necessary to ensure this. Let's start with education, and Laura, to you first. Why is it so important to help drive the understanding forward and how it can be improved?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, we live in a world that is it's dependent on science and technology. but most people don't actually understand the scientific process. And so then there becomes an issue when you have to make a choice. And one of those sort of critical decisions which everybody's making right now is, for example, should I get vaccinated against SARS-CoV-2 or not? And there's uncertainty and there's fear when you don't understand the scientific process. And so I think even going back to high school, rather than just, learning about biology in the fact that an amino acid makes a protein, we also need to foster the development of understanding the scientific process, such as digesting evidence, analyzing risk, so we can build a science literate society who trusts in the process and can make really informed choices.
I couldn't agree more, Laura. Science is so much about learning and indeed teaching. I think all of us reflect on the fact that, back in the high school days, we had some really great teachers. And for me personally, the best teacher, my favorite teacher, was a history teacher. And you might think for a scientist and a medico, that's not the right way to be taught in the first instance. But again and again, I've come back to the importance of teaching. The old saying, give a person a fish and they can eat for one day. Teach a person to fish and they can eat for the rest of their lives. It really is something that resonates with all of us who need to learn throughout their lives, learn both new information and also mentor the next generation of people so that they can then build on the shoulders of the discoveries that we ourselves are creating right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. I mean, from learning, say, even if climate change, the impact of that, the next generation is going to be dealing with that. We know that's a human problem, but out there, of course, there are people that have a mistrust in the information that they're getting. And so to have the next generation being empowered to, look at the media, go into the wild, wild west of social media and understand what to believe, what not to believe, then they can make their own choices.
I think you and I both share a great passion for science and biology especially. But what do you think about creativity? I think it was Edison who said genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. How much do you perspire on a daily basis when you're doing your research, Laura?
But creativity is absolutely critical. And that's something that I just didn't grasp when I was learning science in school. As I mentioned up front in my video, I didn't even like science in school because I thought it was rote learning from a textbook.
It's too hard.
And what does it mean? What are the applications of it? When you do real science, it's pure creativity. It's essentially like an art form. You cannot go by the norm if you're going to make discoveries. You need to think of things that people have never thought of before.
I think that's so true. They say, they tell us we have to think outside the box, but so often, and I'm sure you've got examples in your experience so far, it's not just thinking outside the box, but it's joining boxes that weren't previously even connected. Inputs to basic fundamental science, which is so important. And I think we should talk about fundamental science right now, about the importance of basic research that Professor Shine highlighted in his introductory comments.
Absolutely. What Professor Shine said really spoke to me because, of course, it's really tangible to think about, products and translation, new drugs and therapies. But none of this would be possible without the basic understanding, the blue sky research where people worked out that molecule A fed into molecule B to make it work. And so if we sort of, stop, we really need to always highlight the importance of that because there's a pipeline in science and translation doesn't exist without discovery. Yeah. You need both.
No, I want to take a little historical diversion for a second because the thing that I want, especially those in the youth, the people in high school and wondering whether they should explore biology as a potential career path or indeed medicine as I did, the importance of understanding that when we look back in history, it all seems like a continuous path to the logical present. But what people don't realize is I myself have experienced breakthroughs and observed them in medicine where people who would have absolutely died from a disease like leukemia, or who would have bled to death from diseases like haemophilia, or have complications from serious adverse events from toxicity of different drugs. All of those things can be overcome, but sometimes it takes an enormous breakthrough and insight to have that spark of creativity that we just talked about that makes that leap forward. You know, one quick example is it can take 50 years from one idea, like the discovery of DNA in the 50s, to then develop new technologies like bone marrow transplantation or the magic of genetics. And now the exciting field of gene therapy that I'm very much involved in, using genes as medicine, which we're just entering the early age of the genetic therapies for all these different diverse rare diseases.
Yeah, John, it's so exciting to be on the front line of it. I mean, I consider that I haven't sort of been in science for that long. I guess I have, but I've witnessed the era of immunotherapy take off. So when I was learning science in school, the fact that immune cells could combat cancer, that was not textbook, and it was not being used in the clinic. And I've watched that go from strength to strength. I've watched patients with, getting terminal diagnosis be cured by revolutionary immunotherapies. And it's so exciting to watch that happen and to have been a part of that process.
Couldn't agree more. You know, when I was training as a registrar in haematology and blood diseases with leukemias and lymphomas, all we used to do is shoot machine guns at the disease. And, you know, there was so much toxicity involved in the high doses of chemotherapy. And then we learned that it was the immune system all the while along that we were actually taking advantage of. And just so that everyone online understands, the kind of work that you've done is a different way of looking at the immune system. Instead of blowing up the cancers, for example, now we ask the immune system, turn off the brakes and go harder and attack the cancer. And that's the way we release the miracle of the immune system, which then can destroy cancers in our bodies.
Yeah, it's exciting. And when you teach immunology or any sort of biology at the sort of university level, every year you should be updating your lectures because there's always new discoveries that are adding on to that puzzle. And of course, I'm sure you've had in your career, you thought that something worked one way only to be disproved several years later.
I've had some incredibly brilliant ideas, all of which ended up being garbage, I can assure you.
Oh, yeah.
But, this is where the importance of teams really comes in and collaborations. I know you must have incredible joy from working with a really crack group of scientists in your own group. But what about, collaborations and the importance of teamwork in the work we do?
Yeah, it's a team sport, science. You need, of course, collaborations within your own discipline. But then we talked about working outside the box, and interdisciplinary collaboration is also really critical for new technologies, which you can then apply to your own work. Also thinking about the next steps when you're working on, biology that you'd like to translate. Having those relationships with pharmaceutical companies is fantastic because then it's not going to be, say, my team that takes drugs into the clinic. We are sort of at the sort of front end, but you need to have transparency and great communication with, groups at different stages of the discovery process.
Yeah, and flipping ideas on their head and talking to people like engineers or mathematicians or people involved in nursing or clinical trials or any of the aspects of biology and medicine that we need to really indeed flip ideas. Who would have thought that in your area of virology and immunology that that's often viruses. They're the scourge of humanity. Look at COVID, look at HIV, look at hepatitis viruses, look at tuberculosis and so on. But, in my field of gene therapy, viruses are like our friends. We use the viruses as transport mechanisms to efficiently deliver genes to human cells so that they can be reprogrammed to do our bidding and indeed treat people using gene therapy with viruses that have been rendered safe by pulling out all the nasty genes. So thinking outside the box is also flipping the box and looking at from underneath.
Yeah, absolutely. John, do you ever get asked what should the public, will have sort of uncertainty about new therapies, and how do you ensure that science is regulated so people don't, for example, go and make, designer next generation,
goodness, yes,
using science for the other side of the coin.
You know, I had the honour and the pleasure of giving the Boyer Lectures in 2018, and my theme was Life Re-Engineered, and posed the question, if we come to understand the basic biology and genetic hardwiring of what gives us life in terms of the information, the DNA, when we take responsibility for actually being able to change that ourselves, do we have the compassion, the wisdom, and indeed the foresight to be able to anticipate the consequences? Because we've seen during our lifetimes the Holocaust, serious offences to humanity and compassion, where eugenics has been pursued in an aggressive and horrible way based on race. And that, rears its ugly head from time to time. And we need to be mindful of the grand responsibilities that scientists hold as well. And I think that's what you're touching on there, Laura. Indeed, as a scientist, but also as a physician, we have a commitment to strict regulation, and sometimes some cowboys and cowgirls overcome the urge to be able to be compassionate and take responsibility for their actions and push things further than they actually know that they should be.
Yeah, and again, sort of the transparency and communication of scientists to the public, to the policymakers, that's so critically important. With that responsibility of knowledge is the responsibility to translate that knowledge as well.
Absolutely. And as we learn more and more, the famous saying, with knowledge comes great responsibility, rings in our ears. And I think all scientists, from whatever corner they come from, recognize the fact that the responsibility of the discoveries that we're making means that we need to be regulated at arm's length by governments and by other regulators, but also be mindful of our interaction with the public. Science for the public good means listening to the public in a real way and understanding what their wishes are and their desires for a future, hopefully a better world for all of our children and every generation to come, in a future world where perhaps the climate becomes the biggest threat, perhaps disease becomes the biggest threat, other viruses or infections. That's really for the future, and that's why we need to cover all of the sciences. We can never predict where the next threat's going to come from, and maybe you reflected on that specifically with climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, coming back to, again, there are climate change deniers out there. I mean, when you understand science and you understand the process, I mean, this is a human problem caused by humans. Well, it's a global problem, but the human impact is very, very real. And of course, we need biology for the new technologies and innovation to move us towards clean energy. But we also need an active, literate society that actually understands the problem that we're all facing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just moving our next generation to really sort of understanding how we can contribute and mitigate the problem. And by 2050, hopefully sort of put us over on, trying to slow climate change down. It's going to be absolutely critical.
It's really about leadership, I think, Laura, and the fact that we want to increase scientific literacy so that no one could ever doubt that there are things that we need to understand so that we can be confident that, for example, vaccines are the safest medicine ever invented and still continue to save lives in all of the different diseases during childhood and now, of course, COVID. And I also reflect on the fact that one of our greatest scientists, I'm sure an all-time hero of yours and certainly mine, Professor Peter Doherty, who won the Nobel Prize in Immunology, has more recently been speaking about climate change as one of the greatest concerns in his mind. And if you ever look at him tweeting, he tweets a lot more about climate change than he does immunology these days.
I love that. Peter is the patron of the building I'm sitting in and an absolute hero. And, now, he is doing so much public good in really communicating science. It's so important because who do people listen to? There's so much fear-mongering. Things are sort of picked up by the media and portrayed in certain ways. And with Peter doing the amount of tweeting that he does, that's incredible because then you have a respectable voice out there on the internet, telling it how it is, bringing those big issues. That's somebody that you can trust in. And we need more people like Peter, respected scientists that's somebody to listen to.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to hearing us engaging with some of the questions that
Yes,
Paul
Laura
might be
and John,
able
I
to...
just wanted to ask some of those questions. We do have them coming through from our viewers now, and thank you so much for that incredibly engaging discussion on the topics. And just a reminder that if you have a question for our speakers today, you can use the Q&A panel on the side of your screen. So I'll go to a first one here. This is from Christina, who asks, in a world of funding bodies increasingly asking for real-world impact in funding applications, how do you feel that fundamental research can be supported by the public and researchers? I might throw that first to you, John.
I can't emphasize enough the importance of supporting basic science, and it's sometimes harder for the public to understand because it's not as directly connected with medical advances that they can see immediately in their loved ones or hear about on the news. And oftentimes these advances are sometimes so esoteric, they're really even hard for a scientist to understand outside their own field. But we have to commit to things like astronomy and things like space exploration and things that may not immediately seem directly relevant to the here and now of medical therapies, because in the future we get microchips out of space technology, and those are the unexpected perhaps advances that they actually create. I'm certain Laura's got examples as well.
It's, something, this is so close to my heart because I'm a basic researcher. And with the current funding structure, I think our Nobel Prize winning discoveries actually their grants wouldn't have been funded because they would have been too big sky, big ideas. Where's the evidence of direct translation? You can't translate without understanding the biology first.
Okay. It highlights for me the critical importance of this concept of bench to bedside and back. And so that's the laboratory bench that someone like Laura works in, and the bedside that I've had my clinical work in from time to time. And the point is, it's a circle, a virtuous cycle that we talk about, and it has to go in both directions. The big breakthroughs tend to be made in basic science, in my opinion, and then they're translated into clinical applications. Unless we have a robust pipeline, Paul, from basic science through so-called translational research into the clinic and then tested in robust clinical trials and proven, then we have a failure. But the clinical trials then impact on the next generation of therapies. So it really is a cycle.
Yeah, fantastic. I've got another question now to you both. In fact, I'll ask it to Laura. Would you agree that psychology is very important, and many scientists lack the perhaps social science that might be needed to communicate their science in the context to the general public? What's your comment on that, Laura?
Yeah, again, I think that's really important. Scientists need to be communicating their science. Often we speak so technically that nobody understands or would really want to listen to a scientist. Sometimes when they talk about the nitty-gritty, this is where, coming back to training the science communication process early in high school is so critical. A lot of scientists aren't trained to communicate their science. Often they're too busy, touching back on the last question, writing grants for their survival, that they feel like they don't have the time. But it's so critical to be so transparent, involving the public in the process, in what we do, highlighting the importance. And so I think the way forward is really to have integrated science communicators within bigger research teams who can then go and translate the discoveries straight from the bench to the stakeholders, policymakers, decision makers.
I agree completely, Laura, but for me, it's even bigger. I reflect on the fact that we've talked so much during our conversation about creativity and passion and thinking outside of the box. But where does that well of creativity come from? I find that I'm inspired oftentimes by history and especially by art. Back in the days when I used to travel, I would always find an opportunity to go to an art gallery and be inspired by the thoughts and creativity of others. And even if I was just lost in my own thoughts, that was recharging my creative batteries from sources like art and literature, which then, something works in the back of your head and magically then, but there's a new idea. Maybe I could make use of that. I'm sure you've had the same experience.
I love that, John. Absolutely. In fact, the reason I didn't want to be a biologist as a student was because I wanted to be an artist. My mum's an artist and I love to paint. And sometimes I will draw scientific diagrams, and that's often how I can come up with new ideas, just by, drawing through the process. And so, yeah, I'm totally with you. So lovely to hear you say that.
Look, thank you so much, Laura and John. That was an absolutely fascinating discussion, and we're off and running. We're going to move on now with chemistry, and that's going to be talking with Professor Thomas Maschmeyer and Professor Veena Sahajwala.
Well, in my world of making materials, I'm probably best known for making green steel, which is really all about bringing in the wonderful world of chemistry, where all kinds of waste materials like tires and plastics are used in the process of making steel.
So I'm best known for catalysis, and catalysis is how you accelerate a chemical reaction. If I have 10 different chemical reactions, I can selectively accelerate one reaction, making the whole system much more selective, producing less waste. And the two most impactful applications of this have been, in my career, waste management, so taking plastic waste and biomass waste into new products for the circular economy, as well as in electrocatalysis, where we've been able to accelerate the internal functioning of batteries and make them much more effective. So I fell in love first with chemistry, I'm told, at age 2 or 3. So when I was able to stand up on my own 2 legs and walk around a little bit, I was a great experimentalist on the windowsill, mixing different colors and seeing what happens. And that sort of really never changed and never finished and never stopped. I still love mixing things and see what happens, and all the way through high school and then at university, where I studied chemistry as my major and did an honors and PhD in it. And the main fascination as a synthetic chemist is to really draw up on a piece of paper something that you expect to happen, design a new molecule that just doesn't exist, and then make it happen, mix stuff together, and then, a week, a month later, you have it in your hand as a new crystal of a new compound that you've created, that just did not exist before. That's super exciting.
Well, for me, chemistry was one of those disciplines being in school, is to be able to ask the almost impossible questions, which is, oh, wait a minute, how is this steel made, for instance? How's this material made? And of course, when I started to think deeper and deeper, it was pretty obvious it was all that chemistry that made things come to life. For me, that was that moment of realization that I could take it further beyond anyone had ever imagined. And I started to think about recycling materials and actually imagining what different kinds of waste could become in their new lives.
Chemistry as a central science is really, really fundamental, and it is very fundamental to understand chemistry to influence what's happening in terms of understanding how we are treating our environment, what the effects are in our environment, how we make processes better, cleaner, more effective, how we use energy more efficiently, how we store energy more efficiently, how we generate energy or power, I should say, more effectively. That's all down to chemistry. Chemistry is really the interface between us and the rest of the world, and therefore having a deep understanding helps us to not just understand chemistry, but to some degree understand our place in the world and how we interact with the world.
Chemistry actually plays such an important role, whether you're talking about those essential materials, things that, make our buildings, our cars, things that provide us with all the essential products in our lives. Chemistry plays such an important role because it actually allows us to make them, and it allows us to constantly create safe products that are good for our people and good for our environment.
So the one thing I would say to my 13-year-old self is follow your dreams, follow the excitement that you feel by asking questions, by asking why. Never stop asking why, and be excited by the answers that you get, or the answers which are not there yet and which you might get for the rest of us.
To me, as a 13-year-old, when I was always curious about how you make things and why you'd break things and how things would actually fall apart, there was absolutely no question. And if I had to go back and tell myself, I'd be saying it's a whole new world of possibilities and a whole new world of discoveries just waiting to be discovered. So whether it's the work that I've now discovered, my green steel, or indeed some of the new work of green ceramics, I'd say it helps me make all those impossible things into possibilities.
Now, joining me live, please welcome Professor Thomas Mushmeyer and Professor Veena Sahajwala. Thanks for being with us, Veena and Thomas. So, Veena, you've told me your discoveries are driven by new ways to use chemistry. You ask, why are we doing it this way? Tell me a bit about your research journey and what asking that question has led to.
Yeah, look, I mean, from my point of view, certainly, and it's very much a collaborative effort, recognizing, our partners in industry, in research, our team members at Smart Center at UNSW. It's been a very rewarding journey. We've had all kinds of incredibly fantastic, ways in which we've taken recycling waste tires, put that in the process of making steel, showing how discoveries like green steel can actually be taken out into the real world and can be commercialized. And I guess to me, ultimately, the ultimate sort of revelation in all of this is all of that science that was being discovered in the labs. We're starting to see all that benefits come through in practical steelmaking operations. So I think to me, the ability to use waste tires in the process of steelmaking is really just one example of how green steel has shown that you can not only recycle waste materials, but you can reduce your dependency on coal and coke. And in light of where the needs are of our society, of our world, the ability to actually show that a lot of that fundamental science and that discovery in the labs can actually be translated and shown to have real world impact and benefits has been a very rewarding journey. And we continue on that path where we wish to take that steel making work that we're doing to the point where we can completely eliminate the need for coal and coke in green steel.
So many people ask me about drivers in terms of, how does one become a scientist, and what especially is about chemistry that's so exciting. And I think a scientist is really driven by his or her intellectual curiosity and his sense of wonder and a sense of fun to understand the world around us. How does it actually all hang together? And of course, at the level of making and breaking chemical bonds, that is life around us. That's the mountains slowly, eroding away, or things of that nature. So it's really able to understand what is happening around us and then to interact with it in a meaningful way and find out, important problems. And we have heard the IPCC report recently, and of course there are some really big important problems. And chemistry holds a key to answering some of these very much. So my research is in catalysis, and that is to make chemical reactions go faster. And clearly, we need to absorb somehow CO2 and preferably not emit too much CO2 so that our carbon balance will be in a good shape. And for that, we need things like renewable energy. We need to generate the power. We need to transmit that power. We need to store it. We try to decarbonize industry. We try to decarbonize agriculture. Maybe make it so successful as to be able to store carbon in the soils, and also decarbonize transport. And all of those areas are strongly affected by chemistry and chemical understanding, whether it's the materials side, the actual chemical side, say in the battery as things are being charged and discharged, So chemistry is really a fundamental glue that holds together our place in the world.
It's interesting you mentioned one word I picked up there, Thomas, and I think what a lot of people, especially young people, want to understand the impact and where the future is. And I think sometimes, of course, we hear a lot of stories which are reporting on some of the rather big challenges, as you mentioned, Thomas. So I wonder whether, you see, and I know in both of our worlds, as you've alluded to, the whole sort of big question on decarbonization, the world of making products and manufacturing, to reflect on the fact that carbon intensity of many of the production processes and manufacturing play such an important part in our way in which we think about decarbonization. But also, you mentioned in there an important word, having fun and being really curious and really in light of all of these challenges that the world is facing. What would you, I guess, recommend to a young person who's sort of thinking about, this big world? So on one hand, it can be easy to feel overwhelmed, right? But on the other hand, I guess we've got to have hope. We've got to have hope that says, here's how, I guess chemistry can really play such a positive role. And that's why I wanted to pick up on a comment you made around decarbonization. And perhaps I'd love to hear what you think about how
thank
we
you. And I will pass the baton back to you as Chair of New South Wales Circular in a moment. But one thing, first of all, I always say we've got to learn to love the future again. We shouldn't be scared by it, but the future is a great place to be, and much better than the alternative. And, there's a lot of good stuff happening out there. And in terms of what people can do on an individual basis, well, every molecule of carbon dioxide that is not emitted doesn't have to be somehow sequestered or dealt with. Equally, every little bit of litter that's going around in the world does not need to be picked up again if it doesn't end up there in the first place. So everybody on the individual basis can make a difference, and a difference that over many years does count. So from that point of view, even small things really add up, and they do count. One big, keyword here is the circular economy. So reusing our materials over and over again. So if we wanted to live the same lifestyle for the whole of the world as Australia has, we would need resources of something like 6 planets. We only have one. So we need to reuse what we're doing.
Well, I mean, this is exactly right, isn't it? And I guess, to your point about reuse and recycling, but there's also an inherent sort of question in there when we think about UN SDGs, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. One of them that, we can talk about is related to what you said about, consumption. So there's that sort of question around, our responsibility as individuals when we talk about, consumption habits. So I think connected in all of this is recognizing that, to pick up your point, we only have one planet, but also to address that question of equity when we talk about how actually our habits at an individual level need to be seen in the context of the overall planet. So this is where, of course, a question of equity comes in when we start to think about developing scientific solutions and technologies. I think thinking in a broader sense around sustainability. So in everything we do, the kinds of processes and materials that go into meeting the needs of our society, we do play a very important role in really challenging the norm and asking if this production has always been done in a certain way, is that really the right thing to continue? And so it's about questioning. And this is where, of course, we play such an important role. But, as a young person who's thinking about the impact that they can have, whether it's about actions that they take at the local level, it could be in their schools, in their communities. I think that's all important because what you do is you actually inspire others to think differently. So I think sometimes that connecting what you might have in your mind about your scientific endeavors, and you're bringing your communities, your friends, your family on that journey with you is such an important role to play because it comes right back to.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. So the acceptance by society of one's ideas and solutions is key. And as scientists, as engineers, all we can do is really offer opportunities, options, but society has to choose those options. And often they need to be demonstrated. So we did it with Lysella, my startup, and in combination with Nestle and Coles, where we are showing the whole value chain of soft plastics, which normally end up in landfill or get incinerated or get into the environment, and able to recycle all of those back into plastic wrappers for the next generation of foods to be protected by very lightweight, very effective packaging. And that was a revelation for many people who didn't realize that there were about 10 companies involved in that whole value chain. So as scientists, I guess I would say that people need to also think through not just making the option, but interacting with society to really make society or help society understand what that option is and how can it be potentially implemented.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's such an important point you make, isn't it? I mean, when communities have the option and the choice, I mean, an example of what we've done in terms of production and manufacturing and taking it right back to a really small level, which is where our micro factories have come in. We've actually shown this year by launching it out into the commercial world, and of course the support of science, but also equally that support of where that journey to commercialization comes in. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you about that, but part of that sort of ability to bring in so much of that support, and we recognize support from both yes, there's the Australian Research Council, which is fantastic to support that basic science, and then we've got, of course, the support that we get from, in our case with micro factories, supported through the Office of the Chief Scientist and Engineer here in New South Wales, which provided that physical sciences funding. But I want to use that a particular example because we actually took our micro factory out into a regional town, and we're basically running that in Cootamundra. And the reason why I wanted to use that as an example is showing locally available waste glass and textiles and all this feedstock material coming into manufacturing a green ceramic that then can go back into building applications, is kind of showing that we've got all these different pathways. So when you feel a little bit overwhelmed, you feel like, okay, well, you know what, I've seen all this sort of, sometimes that bad news, but you've got to lift yourself up and think about, that spirit of collaboration, and working with industries and your research partners. That can be really uplifting when you can actually share your
and to be in a sense inspired by the problems, that there is a problem out there, and you as a young person might be the one who will solve the problem for the rest of the world.
Yes.
And we may have seen, some of you may have seen that there was recently a fire in the latest large Tesla factory, and LG has had to call back 10,000 of their batteries in the US because of issues. So safety is a big issue with current lithium-ion technology. So that inspired me to come up with a new kind of battery, which is flame-proof, explosion-proof. It stops a bullet, so we try to shoot it with an army rifle, and it's doing very well. So trying to address that safety element was really a response to the issues that we had out there, but still the need for batteries to be absolutely part of the solution to the transition for renewable energy. So don't get downhearted by problems, get inspired by them.
Exactly, which I think, also then allows us to really, think about both, as you correctly pointed out, safety, sustainability. And when we think about making new products, if you're starting to challenge yourself in a far more holistic manner, it's about ultimately taking a product, making it in a way that is safe, it's sustainable all the way through manufacturing and use. But also there are other important questions when we think about how are we going to make sure that access to these kinds of technologies are available across the world. So it's back to that point about, scalability of something that can be done on a small scale in a local setting has got a lot of important benefits. So so I think we're on to something.
Yeah, and for markets to be able to interact with those sorts of things, we need obviously enlightened politicians and market setters.
Yeah, we'll have a few questions from the audience now. Thank you both so much for that fascinating discussion. If you'd like to send your questions in, please use the Q&A panel on the side of your screen. I have one here from Professor Andrew Holmes, who wants to know from both of you, can you please suggest a piece of chemistry research that we should be undertaking because the outcome will in the future be for the public good? Perhaps first to you, Thomas.
So one of the research areas that is certainly for the public good is our waste, plastic waste upcycling or recycling. We're trying to take about 50 to 60% of all of Australia's waste and put it back into the circular economy. We're rolling it out worldwide with 1 million tonnes projected by 2025, and having that kind of impact will mean that environmentally things are better, energetically things are better, and more jobs are created in regional areas. And it's also a developing economy kind of problem where there is no value for waste at the moment. And with this kind of technology, that waste will get value and therefore will be treated differently, and there will be more resources that can be deployed to get a better outcome.
So I guess in my case, I'd probably take that approach of manufacturing at a scale where you can do it in a decentralized way. So you can actually show that recycling, because we all love to recycle. We want to see that happening in small communities, in remote communities. You can actually now start to imagine recycling being coupled with manufacturing. So you're looking at waste transformation in a way that you can actually reform waste into completely different products. So an example of what we're doing in setting up and running our microfactories is showing that the kinds of green ceramic products that we've made, bringing together waste glass and waste textiles, converting that into hard, durable products that can go into built environment settings, really shows that we can actually manufacture some of these highly engineered products from waste without having to then depend upon products that have to be imported from overseas. So it's also showcasing what we can do in a small scale setting in a microfactory. So whether it's about making green ceramics or indeed harnessing some very important metals and rare earths coming out of e-waste, the ability to do that in a microfactory setting means that it can really show that the ability to couple together recycling and manufacturing, and bringing together the ability to harness a lot of these critical materials, but channel them and working directly into small scale manufacturing operations allows us to really decentralize these solutions.
Thanks, Thomas and Veena, so much for that fascinating discussion. Now, don't forget, if you have any questions yourself, then please use the Q&A panel on your screen. Now let's move on to mathematics with Professor Nalini Joshi and Professor Geordie Williamson.
I'm best known for my work on difficult functions that are new functions in the sense that they have not been described before and they can't be described in terms of earlier known functions. These are transcendental functions that are more transcendental than functions we've known before. Now, in what sense are they difficult to capture? Well, they are invisible to the ordinary tools of mathematical analysis.
I'm best known for resolving two long-standing conjectures in mathematics. So in mathematics we have conjectures, which are statements that we believe to be true but don't yet have proofs for. And they involve representations. So I'm a representation theorist, and representation theory is a relatively young subject in mathematics. It's about 100 years old, or a bit over 100 years old. So I was a late bloomer mathematically. In school I enjoyed maths, but I found many other subjects and many other pursuits more interesting. It was only towards the end of university, I basically was doing an arts degree and I was taking some mathematics courses. And I took a course in a subject called Galois theory. And this totally blew my mind, the depths of the ideas and the vision of Galois, who was a French mathematician, and he had in about 1830. and then I was hooked, and I've basically never looked back.
So my earliest memories of games I played as a child involved amazing counting patterns. These were Burmese games that I played as a very young child on army bases in the Shan states in Burma. They involved working out patterns from knowing a few of the examples and then being able to predict more and more of them as we went along. So we would play a version of hopscotch and then start these counting patterns. They were different each time. They went far beyond any kind of times tables that we knew about at that age. And I remember just being entranced with the patterns that you could see and predict. And I didn't know at the time that that was mathematics. It was just something that amazed me and delighted me as a child.
I'm not sure maths is fundamentally in the public good. It certainly can be in the public good, and I think it's very important that we keep that in mind as mathematicians. But I think that with every passing day, mathematics is present in our life more and more. We're surrounded by technology, and this technology is doing a whole lot of things that appear effortless, but are actually the result of many, many hours of thought and effort by mathematicians, computer scientists, and engineers. For example, when your Google Maps suggests a route to take, or your Wi-Fi connection works or maybe doesn't work so well, these are mathematical ideas at the basis.
The immediate example that comes to mind is how we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. All of the information that you're seeing in the news about infection rates, about hospitalization rates, about policies to do with lockdowns are driven by mathematical models. Without mathematical models, we wouldn't be able to say when something is becoming very dangerous and more effective, harder policy actions are needed and how long they have to go for. So in this context, mathematics is inseparable from the public good. And it is the only mechanism we have that allows us to make informed decisions to overcome the pandemic.
Stay curious. Don't be sure about where you want to go. Stay interested in the world. Be happy to change direction. But I think being interested in the world is the most important thing.
What I'd like to say first is accept yourself because you belong here. Your appearance doesn't define you. And then I'd like to point out that you don't need to be defensive. You know, if you're the asker of questions all the time and you irritate people with your questions, just be open to other people. Don't close it off. You can belong here in the setting where you can still ask questions. And thirdly, I'd like to say, remember to check with the evidence. And you can try to understand the universe. You can be an astronaut if you want to be. Just don't be scared.
All right, now joining me live, please welcome Professor Nalini Joshi. And Professor Geordie Williamson will be with us very shortly. Just had a slight problem with his connection. So, look, I'll start with you first, Nalini, and I might just skip forward to ask you, you've said to me before that mathematics is intensely collaborative. How is that so? And is that the case with other areas of science as well?
So let me start from a slightly different starting point, and then I'll come back to hone down on your question. So there's a joke that goes like this. The questioner says, "What's your favorite thing in maths?" And the answer comes, "Knot theory." Knots, knot theory. So the questioner relaxes and says, "Me neither." But actually, more seriously, I wanted to say that I love mathematics because it's the most powerful way I see that I know of seeking the truth about the universe. And the other part of it, which I absolutely love, is that it's a game I can play with people. And that's what leads to collaboration and its beauty for me. So the thing about mathematics, it's like every other human endeavor, really. Everybody has a personal way of seeing mathematics or seeing the world. The terminology may be different from one person to another. The metaphors that people use are different inside their own minds from what's inside another person's mind. So some of these metaphors are shared inside subfields, but most of them are not shared with other people and certainly not outside subfields. So a great deal of insight comes from being able to communicate some of these settings in your mind with other people. You suddenly see new perspectives and new windows open up in your mind. It's an absolutely amazing experience when it happens with the right person. And so even though people often portray mathematicians as lone geniuses locked away in attics for years or even decades, or hermits of some kind, it's actually essential for their progress in mathematics that they are able to communicate the ideas that they're developing to other people. So in particular, even Andrew Wiles, who reportedly worked in the Princeton attic of his house for 7 years trying to solve or to prove Fermat's last theorem, actually had somebody that he would talk to every Friday afternoon, I believe, for those 7 years. And he needed to do that in order to develop and shape those ideas.
Nalini, we have Geordie with us now. And Geordie, I wanted to bring you in to just ask the question. You once referenced the world's longest conversation is how, you've described mathematics to me. Geordie, can you explain the idea behind that and how it applies in the fundamental research that you do?
Yeah, so this is a quote, I believe, from Barry Mazur, who is still a professor at Harvard. And I just think it's a beautiful analogy that, so Euclid, for example, at 300 BC, wrote an amazing book that many, many mathematicians have read. And there's still questions that are alive today from Euclid's work, and we're still talking about them. And so I see mathematics as this long conversation where you might work for 40 or 50 years just to have a chance to say one tiny thing in this beautiful long conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful analogy, a beautiful way of expressing what mathematics is and how mathematicians work. Some years ago, I think it was about 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to meet somebody who was conversant with a totally different area. You see, I'm trained in applied mathematics and he wasn't. But the opportunity to convey my questions to him and for him to have that respectful absorption of the questions that I was asking, and then to try and make a serious effort at answering them, led us to a collaboration that was really deep and profound one of my career, I think. And it's led to so many other results that I've had in the past decade or so that I want to tell everybody that it is, in fact, that conversation that we seek. It is a way of bridging fields that are seen by practitioners in each particular field as often tricky, unnecessarily opaque or abstract, to try and find the common language so that we can tackle problems together. That is so good about mathematics. So I really love that quote about mathematics, Geordie. I think that's a wonderful way to put it. And I really also love going back, sometimes centuries, to find things that were said by people like Newton, Leibniz, Gauss, etc. People say, librarians sometimes say, well, surely you don't need these resources anymore because they're so old. And I'm saying, well, wait a minute, I still need these books and these these papers from 100 years ago, sometimes 140 years ago. So yeah, the conversation still continues. So what do you think about the idea of collaboration for you? I already mentioned it just before you came online, in terms of being able to, it's sort of like playing games with friends, being able to connect with people, being able to have a way of being heard about ideas that in new ways, new metaphors that actually open up windows in your mind. What do you think about that?
I think it's one of the least understood aspects of mathematics, that we are intensely collaborative, and collaboration is so important to what we do. I'll just tell a story from when I was a postdoc, which is that I'd had some collaboration with a Japanese mathematician, some emails, and we were both interested in the same problem. And I visited him in Japan, and it was extraordinary. I turned up on in the train station and met him, and we almost couldn't speak to each other. I'd never seen him. We'd had this very, very intimate relationship via email, intimate mathematical relationship. And it just struck me as, where else can you do that? Where else can you have such a connection with someone that you can barely even speak to?
Yeah, absolutely. So we could go on like this, but I think we also needed to talk about mathematics and the public good. And I think in the video you might have made a comment about that, that it's not necessarily always done in the public good. Do you want to expand on that?
I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind. So we mathematicians, particularly a century ago or something, so G.H. Hardy has this famous quote where he said something along the lines of, "I'm so proud of everything that I've ever done being utterly useless."
Yes, I remember that quote. I think it was related to somehow a problem that he'd worked on with respect to trajectories of artillery that was used by the army during, it was either the first World War, and he was deeply affected by the way that it was used. But anyway, go on.
And I think that so it's kind of a remarkable today. So G.H. Hardy was a number theorist, and so he liked prime numbers and things like that. And every single time that we use the internet now, whenever you have an S after your HTTPS, we're using that certain mathematical operations are difficult and certain operations are easy. And this is the basis of internet security. And it seems to me remarkable that something that he saw as being so kind of pure is so practical today. And I just think that we need to bear in mind that it's not a given that what we're doing is in the public good. So if we think about the NSA, for example,
yes.
I think it's very important. I'm not a pacifist. I think it's very important that there's institutions like the NSA. But I also think that it's not so clear that everything they've done in the last 20 years is in the public good. And the NSA employs an enormous number of mathematicians.
Right. Yes. I think about this like any other tool that we have in society. Whether it's used for the public good or not really depends on the person who's using it and how it is intended to be used. So I can't decide whether it is going to be used in one way or the other because I can't control how it might be used in 100 years' time, my mathematics, I mean. But it is the most powerful set of tools we have available because it allows us to predict outcomes. It allows us to quantify uncertainty. It allows us to enable or invent new tools from unexpected directions and angles. It allows us to resolve counterintuitive observations. And so I think that it is something that is available for the public good, and it can't be separated from the public good, because anytime you intend to do good, you have to use the tools that are in front of you, and mathematics is one of the strongest of the tools we have in science. And I think it's somehow invisible in many ways. When we talk about, how we're dealing with COVID, for example, in our society, we talk about epidemiological models. We don't say that they are actually mathematical models, but in fact, that's what they are. So the mathematics is like those steel reinforcement bars that we use inside concrete when concrete is poured to build new buildings. It's invisible, but without it, those buildings are not going to last long. And if we don't look after the strength of those bars by making sure that the surface stays, in place, then it is going to deteriorate, and those buildings, bridges or tunnels will again break down. So I like the idea that mathematics is there, always available for the public good, because it is an indelible part of human invention and therefore of science. And these mathematical rebars are better than the real thing because they can be built in any dimension and adapted to any context.
Have you ever felt a moral challenge in your work, in your mathematical work?
No, not really. I haven't. So the typical direction in which my mathematics has been used and is likely to be used lies in random matrix theory. And these are studies of ensembles of probabilistic processes that can, for example, describe how heavy atomic particles interact, or how other probabilistic processes might be described. So, for example, if you're looking at the major elements of how public transport is scheduled, or how aircraft boarding times are shaped by different strategies for boarding aircraft. Those are the ways in which random matrix theory has been very effective and widely used. And that's the typical way in which the mathematics that I work on has gone. Of course, I can't tell in what way it might be used in the future, but for all the applications that I've seen, in addition to these, from random matrix theory, there have been things in electrostatics and so on. I haven't had that philosophical or ethical challenge.
Well, we've got I've actually got some questions starting to come in from the audience, right. Geordie and Nalini. That's really what a fabulous discussion, and sort of just touching on a number of really important areas there. I might go to one actually, which is a bit of a different direction, and this is from someone becoming a high school teacher, and they're saying that their two teaching areas are mathematics and biology. They've got a question about: do you have any views on how science should be taught in high schools?
Well, the main thing I want to say is that you have to let the students explore. And I don't know how you do that. This is a very difficult thing to incorporate in what is a very busy curriculum for all the teachers out there in our current educational system. But I really benefited from having teachers who let me play with the ideas, run experiments repeatedly over and over again, just to check that Newton's equations of motion still worked. So that was a really powerful thing to be able to do. Or there'd be maths teachers who let me lag behind others in class because I was taking my own sweet time, getting familiar with and exploring ideas in the chapter behind everybody else in class. So that I think of as an opportunity to develop my own powers of observation and my own ways of checking the truth. And I think that's an incredibly important part of education that I'd love it if teachers were to consider in their classrooms.
Geordie, how about for you? Do you have any views on how to make mathematics successfully taught in school?
I totally agree with what Nalini said. I think that sense of play and flexibility is so crucial. The other thing that I'd love to see a little more in Australian society, which exists, for example, you see it very strongly, for example, in Russian society,
which is that people are really excited about mathematics and sciences. And I feel that I had some fantastic teachers, but I still encounter people that just are absolutely uninterested in mathematics. And it seems to me sad. It's like saying, I don't like nature, or I don't like books, or it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think it's just a decision that we've made as a society that we can change just by being a little bit more excited about things.
Now, both of you work in areas of mathematics that are deeply theoretical. When it comes to the application of science, what do you think is most commonly misunderstood about how your work benefits not only progress in the discipline, but humanity at large? Nalini?
So I was thinking about this duality. People often bring that up as though it was a discrete dichotomy. You either have theory or you have applications. But actually, it's a false dichotomy. You can't have theory without the applications to shape it, and you can't have applications without the foundations of theory. So I think of the whole thing as one long sort of continuum in human experience and in intellectual achievement. So if I think about COVID modeling or climate change modeling, what we're looking at underneath the whole engine of those kinds of scientific endeavors is this set of equations. And without knowing the theoretical background that allows us to predict the solutions of those equations, we won't know whether we can trust the results or not. We won't know how volatile the results should be. We don't know how to predict where the parameters that come from measuring things like transmissions, infection rates, and so on, where those sort of very volatile, elusive changes of behavior come from. And all of that is embedded in the theory behind those models. But we go ahead, and if we were to apply the models without knowing about some of that theory, some of those factors that lead, say, for example, the flap of a butterfly's wings off the coast of Brazil to lead to a tornado in Texas or a hurricane on the coast of Queensland, if we don't know about those, then we wouldn't be masters of the models that we're using. We'd be just sort of tapping at them in random sequence, not quite knowing what we're doing. So the two things are intertwined. You can't separate them. And I refuse to accept that all I do is theory because of this intertwining.
That's a wonderful answer. Geordie, I might finish with a question from the audience, and we'll make this the last word. How can we as individuals who understand science better communicate the urgency and inspire others to act to combat issues like climate change? So it's a broader issue about appreciation of science.
So this is a massive one. My opinion, particularly on climate change, is that this is not a scientific issue anymore. We somehow need to become psychologists to solve this. We've known for so long that this is going on. I haven't been doing anything. I feel very shameful about that. I think that we should stop discussing climate change as though it just belongs in science discussion forums. It belonged in science discussion forums 30 years ago. Now it belongs in the day-to-day bread of everyone. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble.
Right.
All right, Nalini and Geordie, it was a fabulous discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today. And now we're going to move on to our final segment, looking at physics with Professor Tanya Munro and Professor Michelle Simmons.
I'm best known for my research in the field of photonics, which is the science of light. I've been able to work with amazing teams of researchers from different disciplines and bring physics to the question of how light can sense the world around us. We've tackled questions like developing lasers for applications in surgery, sensing how embryos develop in an IVF incubator, and understanding what happens to wine in wine barrels. It's a wonderful field. It's full of really amazing new opportunities, but it also is about developing technology that changes the way we live.
I think I'm best known for creating the field of atomic electronics, which is really making electronic devices where the functional element is an individual atom. And the reason why we do that is because we can start to control the world at the level of quantum physics and try and use it to build a quantum computer, which is much faster than conventional computers. In order to build devices with atomic precision, I've had to work to bring together two completely different technologies. One is the ability to manipulate atoms with a very special kind of microscope. And then the other one is to be able to grow layer by layer with atomic precision crystals over the top of them. So in such a way, we've built fully three-dimensional devices that just never existed before. I think I've always liked to understand the way that the world works. And I remember at school with a physics lesson, we had a teacher who was fantastic called Jim Clark, who basically said, if you want to imagine what it's like to be a wave, or how a wave interacts with matter, let's all get up and hold hands and pretend we're a wave walking across the room, and then we bashed into the wall. And I remember thinking, God, isn't that weird? But, conceptually seeing the world visually and then realizing you could write it mathematically made me realize, wow, this is a fantastic thing. And, on the way home that day on the bus, I remember thinking, I like things that are difficult and complex. I think when I grow up, I'm going to be a physicist.
As a kid, I'd always loved maths. I'd loved its puzzles and challenges and patterns. But it wasn't until I had an amazing physics teacher in Year 9 that I suddenly realised that maths was the language of the universe, and that physics was the way of asking questions of the universe. The area of physics I was first drawn to was cosmology and astrophysics, questions like why is the universe expanding and what is dark matter? And then as I got into it, in more depth, I started to see the range of choices and the range of options and fields in physics, and I was hooked. Physics at its heart is about extending the limits of measurement, about measuring things with greater accuracy or in new ways. It's in the public good because we can develop new ways of understanding the world around us, from the quality of our drinking water to what's happening in the depths of the universe. Physics allows us to ask new questions and to help people live the lives they want to have by giving them more information. My own field has made some amazing contributions to the public good. The first is the internet. Anytime you search for something on Google, you send photons scurrying around optical fibres that straddle the globe. Now you can have surgery using lasers that reduce bleeding and damage to tissue and increase your recovery. These are amazing examples of the public good from physics.
For me, physics is, kind of the mother of all sciences. It's really getting down to the fundamentals of the way that the universe works. It's, it's mathematical, it's logical, and it keeps us honest. And so we really, in the physics world, we try and understand everything around us, from how do you get a rocket up into space? How do you use a laser to scan a barcode? What do you use in medical imaging so that you can tell whether you've got a broken bone? And then all the way through, for me, to the transistor, which is probably my favourite invention of all, which really came down to a fundamental effect that physicists were looking at. How do electrons travel through a semiconductor material? How do they conduct electricity? And from that, we created the transistor. We got the information age where we encode in zeros and ones. And now we have the internet. We talk across the world. And it allows us to understand the world in such a much deeper and richer way. And that all comes from that very fundamental understanding that physicists constantly try to figure out.
I would tell my 13-year-old self that physics is creative. You can have crazy new ideas, test them out. You can use it to solve really important problems and discover things that nobody's discovered before, work with amazing people, and travel the world. I'd also tell my 13-year-old self, you can do it. you can make a difference. And just try and make sure that confidence wasn't a barrier.
My advice would be take on the difficult challenges. It's what I've done all my life, and I've found it immensely rewarding. But then in amongst that, I think the other thing that I've learned on my own personal journey is, you choose the things around you that you enjoy and that give you pleasure. And you build up those skill sets, whether it's coding or whether it's design or whether it's sport, whatever it is. Choose the things that you kind of love doing and that build those skills. And that individual set of skills that you do because you love them will take you on the journey to what your life will be. And if you can fit in there difficult things like statistics, coding, maths, then I think you'll find it'll be unbelievably rich and rewarding.
Now, joining me live, please welcome Professor Tanya Munro and Professor Michelle Simmons. Thanks for being with us, Tanya and Michelle. Now, can we start with the role of education, but in particular, the barriers to students picking up physics? You've told me there's a perception that it's too hard or fear of failure can be a problem. Michelle, tell me a bit more about that and how did you overcome those barriers?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think there is a perception that physics is hard. And, in some ways, I think that's something we should embrace. I'm definitely someone that likes taking on the hard subjects. But I think in amongst that, once you get into it, as with anything where you pick up a skill, you realize that it's not that hard. It's just time and effort. But, the other thing I've seen throughout my career is, particularly with young people, when I was teaching in Cambridge, we would have, tuitions with, one or two students. And in particular, when we had two students in the tuition, and sometimes we'd have a guy and a girl, and we would ask a question, I'd always say, who's going to take the question and put it on the board and start working it out? And one of the things that always surprised me was that the guys would get straight up there and start rushing through the question, and the girls would always hang back. And I used to think, God, why do they hang back? And for a long time, I thought it was confidence. They just didn't feel comfortable getting up there and doing the question in front of people. But then, over the years, I've realized it wasn't just confidence. It was actually the fear of getting it wrong, the fear of failure. And in our field, that fear of failure can actually stop you going further, because fundamentally, you only learn by failing and by trying something out over and over again. And the more you try, the more you learn, the more you get out there and discuss it with people, the better you get at it. And so, for me, throughout my career, I've realized if I keep to myself with the knowledge I've got in my head, I'm only going to go so far, and my world will slowly close in. But if I can communicate with others, try it out, fail with others, learn with others, then the whole world opens up. So it's really that, getting into it, having a little bit of confidence to start, not fearing failure. Failure is an absolute positive. It's the only way to learn. And then recognizing the more you do it, the better you get at it. And like anything, when you invest time, the rewards you get at the end are fantastic.
It's an interesting perspective, because I think there is a societal perception that physics is hard. And I think that what you often don't realize until you get a chance to taste physics and physics research is that it's about discovery. It's about exploring. It's about going down a few paths that don't work out until you figure out something that is a rich seam of new discovery. And I think one of the things I've learned is that the more different approaches you have at problems, the further you get, and that's not a solo endeavour. So I think it's everything from perception that it's hard, stopping people giving it a go and realising just the joy that can come with discovery, and the fact that, just about anything in this world where you want to make a difference requires you to persist. And physics is no different from that. And I just would love more people to be aware of the joy that comes with that discovery.
I feel exactly the same, Tanya. It's that once you do it and you get the pleasure of solving a problem, really very few things in life beat it. And for me now, it's got to the point where the harder the problem, the more joy that I get out of it, and the more I want to find a harder problem. and so it's that rich reward that you get that's unbeatable. But you can't get that unless you start and you realize you can't really do it alone. I think that's quite critical, yeah.
And I think it actually relates to the theme of our discussion today, really around physics for the public good. Because one of the things that I've learned is that the real world throws problems at you that tend to be quite thorny, that physics can play a really particular role in solving, that actually, give you some of the hardest, most wicked, interesting problems of the lot. I don't know whether that's been your experience, Michelle.
Yeah, no, it has. I think so. We've talked a little bit in the past about that bridge between fundamental physics and all the way through to applied. And I guess, for me, in my career, I've had the opportunity to start at something very fundamental, something, for me, almost, what I do is moving atoms. Everything we do is not been done before. The technologies that we've had to develop to be able to do that are new. The results that we get are new. The mathematical understanding is new. So at the very fundamental level, we're doing things that are intrinsically difficult and out there where nobody else is there. The knowledge is not there. We're having to build on what the knowledge has been in the past. And so for me, that's fundamentally understanding the universe in a way that hasn't happened before. And my sense is that's what physicists do, is across every level, whatever area of physics they're passionate in, it's that kind of fundamentals that gets them going. And those are some of the problems that no one's ever actually either thought about before or done before. And I think you've had the same kind of experience in the fundamental research area.
Oh, look, absolutely, Michelle. And I think that big quest that you've got to really come up with fundamentally new ways of computing through that manipulations of atoms and pushing the limits of fundamental knowledge is a wonderful, wonderful illustration. My experience has been that quite often some of those fundamental discoveries come as a surprise, and that's been the biggest joy of my journey. Probably the best little story I can tell that really illustrates that for me was when I first started working in the area of defence research more than 15 years ago now. And one of the most practical real-world problems that was brought to me and my team was, could we develop optical fibres that could sense corrosion on aircraft by using photons to scurry around the structure rather than having to pull apart aircraft to see whether they were rusting? And that set us on a journey of discovery about whether we could create optical fibres that didn't contain the light within them, but allowed light to sense the environment around them. And that journey helped us really break through to some very fundamentally new knowledge about the control of light at sub-wavelength scales, which has led to breakthroughs both in fundamental photonics, but also right through to applications in biology and medicine. So for me, it's often that surprise in the journey, that unexpected fundamental discovery that then gives you the applications in different domains that I've found really engaging.
Yeah. I think that's I think that's the beauty of our field, that if I look at all the things that we use every day that we take for granted, like the laser scanner for barcodes, or they're
or the black box flight recorder. I mean, that's another example, isn't it? Yeah.
They've all come from some fundamental understanding somewhere, someone trying to ask a fundamental question. And I guess a lot of people don't draw the line that there is some physicist somewhere many years ago that sat down and asked that question. But then, you're right. So the other thing is, it's such a great field because you can get to go all the way through to applications. And, I guess my experience is slightly different to yours because we set out, can we manipulate atoms? Can we actually build a computer by manipulating atoms? And it's, we're transitioning now from that very fundamental stage to a full-on commercial, this is what we need to do. The actual skill set to do that is completely different. So we're now, more engineering style than we were before. Before it was discovery and, everything was unknown. Now it's like, can we, with our understanding we've got, with the technology we've developed, can we actually make something reproducibly? And
indeed, and that's so exciting because it can make new industries for Australia, and really, it's wonderful to see. In my experience, it's gone back and forward between those two worlds. Sometimes something that's quite engineering will send you right back to the beginning and open up a new space. So, I mean, I think actually what comes out of this is that physics and science at its heart is just a creative pursuit that makes a difference. And that's why I love it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I've really learned through this is the value of teamwork and collaboration. Because I think when I started, very much at the research stage, it was very much collaborate, globally, collaborate with people in Australia, collaborate globally, find the best experts in the world to work with. And now as we're going towards that kind of company stage and engineering something, it's now I've got to get all those different skills. So big teams where we are in each other's pockets every day, completely different skill sets in the same building and trying to make something. And you realize that teamwork and that collaboration is just unbelievably exciting. And when you finally understand something and you've got people from different backgrounds with different languages, even though we're all scientists, understanding something, it's like suddenly it's like, wow. And you realize that allows you to do things that on your own you could never do.
Oh, that's absolutely been my experience, Michelle, as well, is that, when you're training as a scientist, you tend to learn a single discipline and you learn that language, you learn the norms of that field. But then where the real magic happens is where those different fields start to work together. Because in reality, any real world problems need you to cross fields together. No one field can solve anything alone. And that's what I love. And really then I guess I think there's some quite fundamentally exciting things about the application of science. I think ultimately it works best when you bring together the people who'll ultimately use the new knowledge with the people developing it, because otherwise you often end up with a whole lot of solutions looking for problems. And I think one of the most fun things is where people come to you and you've got to figure out how to solve their problem and actually work together. Has that been in your experience?
Yeah, look, absolutely. So we're doing that now because I guess we have people that want to use the computer that we haven't yet built, and so we've got to understand what they want to use it for. And so we spend quite a bit of time understanding what those problems, where they have trouble with computing power at the moment, and then what we can do. But then there's also, we joke about it in the quantum computing world. There's layers of the stack. There's a whole group of people who are, software engineers that allow, and mathematicians that allow us to be able to identify that. We heard Geordie before. What is the problem they're trying to solve? Put it down mathematically. Then we've got to get it into some kind of programmable system that we can run on our physics-based hardware.
Indeed.
And so we get to go for all those layers with all our different languages and experiences, actually in completely different cultures. I mean, I've learned over the last couple of years that software engineers are very different to physicists. And, getting that common language and the way to work is completely different. But, it's great because I would never have known that unless I'd done a project where I had to get to the end user to find the application, and I need software engineers to optimize what we're doing. So
yeah, it's interesting actually. It makes me think that's been my experience as a scientist and as a builder of teams. But for me now as chief defence scientist, what we're finding more and more that we're doing is trying to create a space where actually people with great ideas and potential solutions can actually prototype them, test them in real world environments, and then you get a chance to really see the art of the possible to somehow make that failure safe. Try things, try them quickly, learn from them, and what you do then is you make sure that you accelerate the development of that shared language. So I think is exciting.
So defence is such a big organisation, and yet as a scientist, how's that helped you go into that kind of role? Yeah.
Well, look, there's so many things. I would say that first, it's an organisation of nearly 100,000 people when you tally up all the system, and it's very based on data and evidence, and that's the language of science, and so it is just wonderful having people who know they need cutting edge science and technology. That appetite, that hunger is palpable. What the magic is about bringing together people who create potential new technologies with those potential users and creating that space where they can play, give things a crack, and figure out the art of the possible. That's the creative magic. And to try and do things quickly. And that's the space I'm living within. And because in our world we live in some of our domains, the air, the land, marine space, it's agnostic to disciplines. We need physicists, but we need material scientists, we need mathematicians, we need psychologists. It's all of that coming together. But I'm a physicist, and we're talking about physics today, and I think physics has a really special role to play, because often we're the ones who come up with the fundamentally new ways of measuring things or making tools that all the other disciplines use.
Well,
and that's the nature of physics.
Tanya and Michelle, if I could jump in here, because I think that's a perfect point to bring in some of our viewer questions today. There's one that flows perfectly onto that point you just made, Tanya, and I might ask it of you first, Michelle. This is from Pedro Garcia, who asks, how can physics help you navigate through many different scientific fields and contribute to a better or public good? So what's the strength in physics that helps in that navigation?
Yeah, look, I think it's I think one of the things I've heard all throughout today, everyone's trying to understand the world at its fundamental level. And I think mathematicians see it in a particular way where they write equations. I think physicists are good at identifying problems and trying to find solutions. And as Tanya's mentioned, whether that's defining new ways of measuring things, analyzing the data, and then coming up with actually new technologies that didn't exist before that allow us to probe the world in a different way. And those technologies, again, people take them for granted because they're everywhere, whether it's, X-rays or lasers or communication systems, phones. We literally take them for granted, but there are people that have developed those systems. And I think looking forwards now, the forefront of technological development is what is going to keep the world ahead of where it's at and will help solve the problems that we've created by having technology. So, it's a problem-based problem and solution-based subject where it connects with everything.
Tanya, did you?
I love that, Michelle. I love that, Michelle. And I'd have to say, building on that, learning from history. As humans, we constantly fall into the trap of not being able to see that this kind of discovery, these types of new technologies that change our world will keep coming. Back when the laser was first invented, it was thought to be a pure curiosity, and now they're everywhere and make such a difference in our world. So I think, there's no doubt that we'll keep having these leap ahead breakthroughs that come from physics. And it's just wonderful that Australia has such strength in this regard that can make us a big part of that future.
So next we have more of a statement than a question, but perhaps you'd like to respond to this. It's saying in the past people used to say that you couldn't have a split scientific and creative brain at the same time. How wrong they seem now. You both made the point earlier that actually science is fundamentally creative. Tanya, do you want to follow up on that?
I love the challenge. That's brilliant. I think ultimately science is at its heart one of the most creative things you can do because it's about exploring the art of the possible. It's about combining together ideas in new ways to create new knowledge. And what is more creative than that? It's, I think that ultimately the more we can encourage people who love it, sort of thinking outside the box, doing things in new ways, disrupting the normal way of things, the further we're going to get with our science and the stronger its applications. So I challenge that very, very strongly indeed.
Michelle?
I agree. From my perspective, I think I've mentioned it before, but a scientist gets to look at the world, graphically and visually, and that's a creative process because then they want to draw and describe things that way. They can do it mathematically and they can do it descriptively. And so, bringing that all together is inherently creative. And, depending on what your personal strengths are, you can do that in combinations of ways that nobody else has done. So the whole process is creative.
I think it's just like creating an artwork or composing a masterwork. It's about how you connect ideas, what you make of them, where you take them, and having a vision that pulls it together. If you look at the big breakthroughs we have in science, it's because people take risks. People take on new ideas and they have courage, and I think it's exactly the same in creative pursuits.
Yeah, thank you to you both for that. And I do just want to finish by asking a question I think that's really been on the minds of a lot of us this week with some of the biggest stories of the week, the IPCC's report on climate change. Now, we've been discussing with each of our speakers today the kinds of roles that their disciplines play in a global response to an issue like this. Tanya, what are some of the ways that physics is used in answering this challenge?
Oh, look, physics is an integral part of our understanding of climate and changing climate. The models that we have for understanding our oceans, our atmosphere, are all intrinsically based on rich, complex physics that interacts with other fields of science. But the piece I would say here is that while science will always be important for understanding our changing climate, it's not the issue that's raised in the report. The issue is social. The issue is individuals' choices, societal choices, government choices. And I think it's really important that it's recognised that while the science has a critical role in coming up with mitigation solutions and over time better and better understanding, the science is clear. And the science is not the issue we face today.
Yeah, wonderful. And Michelle, would you like to have the final word there?
Yeah, look, I think, physics helps us to understand the problem, but I do think it can help us solve the problem. And I think, there's a lot of research in, whether it's solar energy or nuclear fusion, things that we can do that can help look in the future about, we have this problem, it's being created by things we've done. What can we do to make it better?
Yeah, wonderful. Well, look, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us this afternoon. A fascinating discussion. Now, we were hoping to have Professor Robin Williams join us this afternoon, but unfortunately, technical issues got the better of us there. But stepping in at the last minute, I'm delighted to have here with me in the Shine Dome Symposium convener and Academy Fellow Professor Ian Chubb. Now, as John Shine mentioned earlier, it was Ian's vision and passion that guided today's event. So thank you, Ian, for your involvement and for being with us at the last minute to reflect on the discussion. So over to you.
Well, thanks, Viv. And I should begin, of course, by thanking all the people who contributed to this, both our speakers today and the back office at the Academy who made it work with a few technical problems around this vast country of ours, but seems to have gone pretty well. I wanted to just pick out a few of the key points that were raised by various people, and just to remind us that when you think about science and you think about how we do science in this country, there are certain sort of words and themes that emerge as you have the conversation, whether it's from physics or chemistry or maths or biology, and some of those themes are, I think, worth emphasising. I guess I'd start though by saying, well, why would the Academy do this? Why would it run a symposium of this type on science and the public good? And I think it's pretty straightforward, the answer to that question, and that is that science is all pervasive. It impacts on all our lives, not only all our lives, but all the time on all our lives, from the materials we use at our home, at work, medicines we take, the equipment we use. The equipment we're using now is very much a scientific base combined with engineering. And I think it's important that we remind our community, our general community, that's an important part of science and how science operates for the public, supported by the public, but works for the public. So we wanted to demonstrate that, but we also wanted to show the community at large that science is not just something done by people who are not like us, that they're somehow sort of different from the rest of us. And we wanted to show you that scientists are normal people, mostly normal people. And of course they do have particular skills and knowledge, and those skills and those talents carry them on their journey. But otherwise they're pretty much like us. They are otherwise, they have their hopes, their aspirations, their ambitions. Of course they have a commitment to learning, and they are, what they also show is that potential is also in so many of us, and we can do it if we want to. If we're prepared to put in the commitment, the effort, the work. We heard about hard work, but not difficult work, just hard work. And I think there's a distinction between the two, that in order to be able to do good science, you've got to put in the hard yards, but it's not an insurmountable problem for us if we want to do that. We heard, I think it was important to hear how they fell in love with their science. All of them, all 8 of them talked about that, and how that has continued to guide their professional lives as they've progressed over the time. Now there were various words and there were various themes that emerged in all of the talks really, and I'll just run through a couple of those because I think they are important. There was excitement, and you could hear it in the voices of all 8 really, the excitement that they got in their voice when they were talking about their science and why they enjoyed doing it. Enjoyment was used. Creativity came up in every single talk, I think. And I think it's important to remember that science is a creative endeavour. You are thinking about how to do things differently, how to learn things differently, and how to be, and to put in that creative effort is certainly a significant part of science in all of the disciplines that we heard about today and in the ones that we didn't too. They talked about time and effort. In particularly, they talked about, or they demonstrated at least, passion, the passion to learn more, and I think that was a really significant part of it all. How none of them were satisfied with today's knowledge, the stuff that you might have read about yesterday. They were actually all talking about how you take what we know and we build off what we know. So history was used to explain the fact that you can build off that base and you can take it, and you can take our science, our knowledge, our understanding to places that we've never been. So they wanted to learn more, they wanted to understand more, and they wanted to use it more. And I think, again, something that came out quite strongly was the fact that you start with a basic understanding, and ultimately, in many areas, at some point in time, and not always a predictable point in time, you can turn that into something that all the rest of us can use. We heard about inspiration, we heard about inspiring people, we heard about curiosity and how important that was from a very young age for students in school, all the way through to people advanced in their careers who were still as curious today as they were back then. And I think that's particularly important. They talked about science as a continuing conversation and how it's always changing and we're always learning because of people like we heard from today doing what they do and taking us into those other places. And I think it's important that we understand that this conversation continues and basically we can't afford for it to stop. They talked about commitment, teamwork, but also importantly we heard about the role of society. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge as scientists that we work in and for a society, in and for a community. The community supports us to do the work that we do. It supports so many of us to do the work that we do. But they also set some rules and some standards by which science works. And so the engaging with the community to make sure that there's a dialogue between enabling us to do the work that we do as scientists and for the community to make the choices that it will have to make when it's given those choices about what to do. A British politician once said that science lets us do more, but it doesn't tell us whether doing more is right or wrong, that there are judgments that the community has to make about that. And in order to get that working properly, there has to be that engagement and that cross-communication between the science community and the community as a whole. We heard, and I think it's particularly important, about the whole science pipeline. We started off and we talked about education, getting young people enthused, understanding the values and the values of science. We heard about the basic research and the fundamental knowledge that gives us about the world in which we live, the physical world, the natural world, the biological world, mathematical world. We heard about all that and how basic research was important to that. We also heard our scientists talk about the translation of that knowledge and not just to write about it in a paper or put it in a book and then move on to something else, but actually to use those building blocks to make products that could lead to translation of the research and to products that will lead ultimately to the betterment of society when the right choices are actually made. We also wanted to show you what some of our scientists do, and as part of that we wanted them to talk to each other and to reveal to you how exciting the science can be. But importantly, and as I've already touched on it, but importantly to show you how they can be excited by their science. And it's that enthusiasm for the discipline, it's that enthusiasm for all of those branches of science that really does, I think, illustrate just how fantastic it can be when you're deeply engaged with science, either as a student or as a practicing scientist or as a member of a community who wants to understand how science impacts on what we do and how we live our lives on a day-to-day basis. So that fundamental science that they talked about, the excitement of it, the understanding, the knowledge, the doing something that nobody has done before. And I've said in my life many times that there is nothing quite like the high you get when you do an experiment that shows something for the first time. Certainly, a short time later, if it's worthwhile, then you'll find that somebody has done similar science or taken it somewhere else or taken it further on. But that's not the point. The point is that it was tremendously exciting to be part of that movement and to get that action and to get that movement taken. And ultimately, you hope that will be one of the blocks of knowledge which gets built into a betterment for the community, a betterment for the society as a whole. And in our case, betterment for Australians, but also betterment for Australia as a good global citizen, because the global problems that we have, and I know that climate change, for example, was mentioned each time about how the disciplines contribute to climate change. But at the end of the day, it's bringing those disciplines together and thinking about how Australia's contribution can lead to global betterment, not just Australian, but global, because we are global citizens. And we will have a much happier and better life if the globe has a happier and better life, or the people on the globe have living systems on the globe have a better and more secure life. Now, the President started this by, and he talked about the work that he did for his PhD, and he made the point that it was about understanding some of the fundamental properties of RNA. Now, RNA are three letters that we would hear about many times a day and read about many times a day in the present press for obvious reasons. But when he did his work, as he said at the time in his opening remarks, that there was no thought of applications, just a basic understanding of that particularly important function in our cells. And now many more of us have got insights into just how important that is. That particular function is in our cells. So if you look at it now from where it began, then there's a huge step function in the knowledge, understanding and use of that knowledge. And so it's talent, the likes of which you've seen and heard today, that will contribute to the solutions that Australians need for a better and more secure existence. And as I said, for Australia to be and to play its role as a good, effective, prominent and very capable global citizen, because without us all playing that part, then life is not going to be the sort of life that we would like it to be. Our President in his opening remarks also talked about the importance of imagination. Now, I could say that our President is one of my heroes because he talked about imagination, and he and I will have that conversation later, but one of my other heroes is a man named Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was an American astrophysicist. He died some time ago now, and he died much too young, but his contribution to communicating complex science was probably second to none in many ways, and the quotations from Carl Sagan and the books that Carl Sagan wrote you can find easily on the web. His one that I like most is called The Pale Blue Dot, which was a photograph of planet Earth taken from 6 billion kilometres away, and there's this little pale blue dot which he describes as a pale blue dot suspended in a sunbeam. And then he goes on to talk about the implications of understanding that everything that has ever happened to any of us through the entirety of history is captured in that pale blue dot. But coming back to the word imagination, one of his other quotes that I think is particularly pertinent to today, and especially given the President's start, was that he said, and I quote, "Imagination can take us anywhere. Without it, we go nowhere." And I think that captures science. So thank you, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Ian, for your insight and for bringing us to a conclusion of our symposium for 2021. I'd like to thank all our speakers and our convener, Professor Ian Chubb. Thank you again to all our Science at the Shine Dome 2021 event partners, and to you tuning in today, joining us to celebrate science. Our next Science at the Shine Dome event will be on Tuesday the 7th of September, when we celebrate 5 of our career awardees. We hope you'll join us then. I'm Paul Richards. Have a great day.